Kia ora tātou, ko te mea tuatahi ngā mihi aroha ki te mana whenua o tēnei whenua, ko te tangata o Wurundjeri, ngā mihi ki a koe Māsia, te kai pau whakahaere o tēnei huihui, whakahirahira mō tēnei rā. Ko waiau, ko tahu kukutai tōku ingoa, he uria hau no Ngāti Tipa, Ngāti Mania Poto, Ngāti Kino Haku, me te o Pauri, no reira tēnā rā tātou katoa. Greetings to you in my own language, te reo Māori. First want to acknowledge the traditional landowners whose land we're meeting on for this really important kaupapa or topic of interest. Thank you, Marcia, for inviting me along to speak. Please don't think of this as a keynote. It's really just a talk where I want to share some of the experiences that we've had in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm not here to share any sort of expertise or tell you what to do. I have been very inspired by some of the talks that I've been able to listen to. Marcia and Ian and Maggie, the leadership that you bring to this topic of Indigenous data sovereignty. Listening to Paul this morning talk about the work they're doing. Listening to Raylene and Karen, the future leaders of Indigenous data sovereignty, really powerful. Listening to Auntie Glenys and Kiana and talking to Kiana over the break. What really struck me is that there's all the elements for a really powerful, influential, impactful Indigenous data sovereignty network that's already here in this room today. And I'm really inspired by that, so thank you for having me here. So I actually, when I saw this title on the program, I was thinking, did I write that title? That's a bloody good title. Did I come up with that? I think it was one of my 2 a.m. imaginings. So there's a lot that's been said about different aspects of data, and I certainly don't want to repeat that. There's nothing worse than you get to the second keynote of a 2-day conference and they're just kind of reiterating what's already been said in different ways. So I want to focus mainly on data sharing and the kind of value that's being extracted from data and how we might respond as Indigenous peoples in a proactive rather than a reactive way. So I guess I want to start off with talking about, and this has been said already in multiple ways, that data are everywhere. And we live in an age where data are everywhere and where the volume of data are growing at an exponential rate. Healthcare data alone in the digital universe has doubled in the last 2 years, although I got that fact from Google about 3 months ago, so it's probably about 18 months now that it doubles. The number of human genome scans doubles every 7 months or so. Some of this data in this vast data ecosystem we create ourselves in real time through smartphones, through Fitbits, through other devices. Fitbits are really interesting because they can measure how many, I don't know who's got a Fitbit on today, but how many steps you can take, your heart rate. Apparently, it can also measure your nocturnal activities. You might want to think about that. But there's no doctor-patient privacy, and collecting your own health data is a little bit like publishing your own medical autobiography online. We now live in an internet of things where devices from fridges to phones to drones can collect data and sometimes have that data shared between devices. And we live in a world where the first thing that a lot of people do in the morning is they wake up and grab their smartphone and do this on Facebook. And Facebook now has about 1.8 billion users, which is about roughly half of the world's adult population. What we like on Facebook obviously reveals a lot about us, our tastes and our preferences. And increasingly, this sort of data, social media data, has been integrated with other sorts of data to target subpopulations and different sorts of groups of people for different sorts of purposes. And this was used, obviously, to great effect in the last presidential election in the US. So increasingly, data that only existed in dusty boxes and archives, and I'm looking here at the Māori Messenger and Māori newspapers for the 19th century, are being digitised and put out into public forums with very little control that Indigenous people have over that, particularly customary forms of knowledge that existed in the archives. So the capacity to link and integrate, reuse and analyse data from different sources for different purposes has also expanded really rapidly. And in most instances, there's no explicit permission that's being sought to enable these data linkages to occur. And so whether we participate consciously or unconsciously in these data collection efforts, we as Indigenous individuals, as families, as communities, are implicitly embedded in the data revolution. So the changing data ecosystem, and I'll talk a little bit about what the Māori ecosystem looks like in a minute, raises some really vital questions related to data privacy, data control, data access and data use, and increasingly data are being talked about in terms of the economic and societal value that can be extracted from the data. And these, I wish I had my little laser thingy because I kind of need it, but these are some of the value claims that are being made around data in the context of Aotearoa New Zealand. And so up here at the top is the tagline from Statistics New Zealand, who's our national statistics agency, which really used to be the bastion of data gatekeeping, now has completely transformed that model and tagline into unleashing the power of the data to change lives, which is a really grand claim to be making. The New Zealand Data Futures Forum, and so that the goal of the NZDFF is New Zealand as a world leader in the trusted use of shared data to deliver a prosperous, inclusive society. Another really big, we were talking about the value of data before, it's not necessarily always in narrow, linear economic terms. There's a multiplicity of ways in which value can be extracted. Here, this is a Cabinet Committee on State Sector Reform and Expenditure Control, where data sharing solutions across government to enable state services to identify new opportunities to achieve better outcomes and improve value for money from initiatives. And at the moment, I'm not sure whether a social investment, the language of the nomenclature of social investment is something that has been kind of permeated government here at the Commonwealth level or the state level, but the social investment approach is certainly one that's driving, and a data-driven social investment approach is certainly now the dominant approach to policy making in New Zealand. Big data is absolutely indispensable to that approach. And the last one, we need to treat our data as national strategic assets and use them to tackle immediate and real problems. So without labouring a point, I think hopefully I've convinced you that the value proposition has been articulated in different ways across this wide data ecosystem. And when it comes to Indigenous data, if data is the new oil, where we need to find it, extract it, refine it, distribute it, and monetize it, it raises a whole set of questions that we really need to grapple for in meaningful ways. And so when I'm making that analogy between data, is this the new land grab? As Indigenous peoples, there's opportunities to develop processes, principles, structures, networks, enabling mechanisms for us to be able to be self-determining, I guess, in this space. But at the moment, some of the terminology that I'm listening to, that I'm hearing, that I'm seeing, that I'm reading about, is about Indigenous data to be shared, to be discovered, to be opened up, but to be controlled or owned by non-Indigenous governments, non-Indigenous entities, non-Indigenous researchers, where the focus is very much, if there are mechanisms and processes around data protection or data governance, it's focused on individual protection and individual rights rather than collective or community ones, and when there's no or only a very vaguely defined benefit to community. Or there may be a rhetoric around benefits to communities, but there's actually no clear and transparent line of accountability, and I think accountability is a really important word, back to communities. There's a lot of window dressing, but sometimes there's not a lot of substance underneath the window dressing, and I think that's something we need to be very mindful about. Okay, so what we're trying to do in Aotearoa, and when I say we, I think it's always important to articulate who's in the we, and I'm now talking about Te Manara Raunga, which is the Māori Data Sovereignty Network that Andrew and I are both a part of, is to try and carve out an alternate vision around our data and our sovereignty and our future and what that might actually look like. And we don't have any magic solutions, But what we're trying to do is to work together to create solutions and take communities and be alongside. Because this is not, it's never going to work if it's a top-down academic endeavour. And just because we're Indigenous ourselves doesn't mean it's an easy pathway. So we absolutely have to work beside our communities in order to do this appropriately. So what does Māori data sovereignty mean in the context of Aotearoa New Zealand? It's pretty simple, really. So it's about the right of Māori to access, to use, to have governance, and to have control over Māori data. Sometimes we might fall into a trap of talking about data sovereignty as if that's the end in and of itself. It's not. It's really just a tool for realising our self-determining aspirations as peoples, as Indigenous peoples, as Māori, as tribes or iwi, as hapu, which are sub-tribes, or whānau, which is family. And so it's really this enabling mechanism that kind of imbues it with its importance rather than it being data for data's sake. And so when we're talking about in the early days, one of the questions that we always got was, you're talking about Māori data, but what do you actually mean by that? And one of the interesting things of working in a network rather than working as an individual academic is that it's kind of forced us to open our eyes about the little narrow slice of the data ecosystem that we're familiar with because of our day jobs. Like as a demographer, I'm really familiar with particular kinds of data sets. That's my kind of bread and butter, my daily job of crunching through the census, crunching through social survey data, routinely collected administrative data. But for other people in our network, it's about the digital infrastructure. It's about the sites of significance that are captured and recorded on GIS systems. It's about processes and archives. There's a whole multitude of ways of thinking about data, and the challenge is to be able to capture that in a way that's really meaningful and that enables communities to be part of that. So here we've got data that are held by tribal entities, by government agencies, by research organisations, businesses, NGOs, and these are all together part of what's a really large and sometimes overwhelming Māori data ecosystem. So I just want to get into the issue of rights control and governance, and we've been thinking about this. We started about data sovereignty, talking about this really about rights, connecting this to the rights in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And it was really interesting talking to some people who work in the data security business. They're saying, well, what do you mean by rights? We don't talk about rights, we talk about control. How do you connect rights to control, and what is the mechanism that bring those two things together? So we've been thinking more about how data supports our self-determined development, and listening to Paul this morning, listening to Mandy and Eunice, this is their visions of self-determining development and well-being that's actually coming from the grassroots. Where control serves rights, for us our rights comes through the Treaty of Waitangi. Those rights can also be connected at the international level to the UN DRIP, to which New Zealand and also Australia is a signatory. But there's also our inherent rights as self-determining Indigenous peoples, which we don't need to defend. Third point is that the data are needed for wise Indigenous governance. In a post-settlement context in New Zealand, and I do a lot of work with tribes and for tribes, there's no point trying to make decisions. It's like driving in the dark if you don't have the right information. And Indigenous entities need that information. They need the right information at the right time to make the sorts of decisions to activate the strategies that they're created at the governance level. But we also need, because we're in a state of data dependency that's been described really well in talks that have preceded this one, a lot of the data about us are actually held in repositories that we have no control over. But that data is rich, it's important, it's impactful. It's often being used by other people to tell our stories about us through different lenses. And what's really needed is robust and transparent and accountable governance structures over that data. So it's not just about us controlling our own data, but also finding a pathway to have meaningful control over data that's been held by other people. So I think if we kind of think about control as being on a continuum from low control to high control, there's Facebook and social media data over which Indigenous peoples largely as collectives have very little control, despite your privacy controls and so forth on your individual account. But as a collective, we have very little control over that data. And then we have, in the context of Aotearoa at least, tribal register data, which will have genealogical data and other sorts of individual level information attached to it, through which tribal entities will have a high level of control. But in the middle is this other sort of, in that middle of that continuum is a whole bunch of other data where there's a massive opportunity for robust, accountable and meaningful data governance. We don't have all the answers. We don't even have a partial part of the answers really in Aotearoa. This is what we're trying to figure out for ourselves. But what we can do is learn from our Indigenous brothers and sisters in other parts of the world. I've learned so much already from being here at this symposium. You may be familiar with the principles of OCAP, which have been developed over 20 years through the First Nations Information Governance Centre. We've had people from the FNIGC come to 2 of our community gatherings now and talk about the OCAP principles, which are trademarked. I encourage you to go to the FNIGC website and look at how the story of OCAP, how it emerged and how it's actually been operationalised in practical context, because it gives real meaning to notions of community consent and community control and elevates it beyond the individual. So OCAP stands for Ownership, Control and Access and Possession, and it's really the set of standards now that establish how First Nations data should be collected, protected, used and shared, and it's a really great model. Now, it's not that you can just take that like a cookie cutter and drop it over your own context. It doesn't work that way, but it certainly provides a really meaningful and robust foundation for us to begin some conversations with. For us in Aotearoa, the challenge is really to move from, at the moment, the conversation is stuck to some extent in the access space, opening the doors and granting access. The challenge is to move from access to control, not just the rhetoric of control, but actual control. And then maybe conversations around ownership and possession as well, where that data is appropriate. There's no point trying to possess every single data source. It makes no sense. There's a whole lot of technological and infrastructural and resource implications that come from that. So it's about meaningfully working through what data needs to be accessed, what data needs to be controlled, if so, how is that going to be controlled, what data actually needs to be physically possessed and owned. Now, I'm mindful that I've probably only got about 5 or 10 minutes left, and I just wanted to talk about some concrete examples of how we're grappling with these issues of data governance and data control in our context. And because the data ecosystem is so large and so complex, I'll pick some examples from different parts of the data ecosystem. So you may not have heard of the Integrated Data Infrastructure, the IDI. So this is part of the national government's ambition to become a world leader in the trusted use of shared data. So what the IDI basically does, it's an integrated micro data set that draws from a whole bunch of government administrative data sets. The spine comes from tax, so that's tax data. It has the census data in there, survey data in there, data that's really routinely collected from education and training, from income and work, benefits and social services, population data, health data, justice data, housing data, data. It's all there in the integrated data infrastructure. It's probably one of the most sophisticated, it's probabilistically linked, it's de-identified. There's no single identifier that travels across all of those systems, so they have to be probabilistically linked for the most part. But it's an incredible resource and it enables a level of surveillance that's never before been possible in the context of New Zealand and probably not in many other countries outside of Scandinavia and some European countries. Now, it's accessed within a 5 safes framework which meets with universal and international standards around data security and privacy at the individual level, and it absolutely does protect individuals, and Statistics New Zealand has been a wonderful steward in terms of the 5 safes framework. But the problem for Indigenous data, given that Indigenous peoples, Māori, are a key focus of the integrated data infrastructure, is that there is no mechanism for Māori data governance to ensure that that data is being analysed, interpreted and disseminated in a way that's safe. Safe for communities, safe for families, safe for tribes and safe for us as a people. So as an advocacy group, Te Mana Rāronga has been having conversation with Statistics New Zealand, and what are the opportunities for us to co-create a governance framework, principles and processes that can sit over the top of the integrated data infrastructure so that we as Māori can have confidence and trust that the extent of data linkage and sharing that's going on is actually going to benefit us, not in a sort of intangible, abstract way, but what's the line of accountability and benefit back to communities, and how can we make that transparent? And that this is absolutely fundamental to building a world-leading integrated data system. You need to maintain that trust and confidence, and that's why data governance is so critical. As part of that, we've been trying to develop an emerging framework, and I'm not going to labour the points, and I'll make this PowerPoint available if you want to see it. But the important point, there's 2 important points here. One is that it makes no sense to take a corporate or Western governance data framework and then try and shoehorn Indigenous ambitions into it. So we're trying to start from a Māori conceptual framework. What are the values that are important to us in terms of data? And then how can we build from there? So it has a Māori conceptual basis to it, and then we kind of operationalise that in terms of the characteristics of the data, and then the assessment questions so that organisations can engage with that in a way that actually is meaningful for them. So asking questions like, how does the use of this data add value to the community? Will the community support the use of this data? Does the user have the expertise and the experience to actually use the data in a culturally appropriate manner? Not just a technically proficient manner. That's absolutely vital. I wouldn't dispute that that's really important. But culturally appropriate lens is just as important as technical proficiency and parsimonious, high explanatory statistical models. And will the data be protected from inappropriate use? So those kinds of questions that go along in the framework. I kind of speed this up. The second example was cultural licence. I'm not sure if you're having a national conversation around cultural licence in the moment, or social licence. But the social licence conversation is one that's been probably dominating in New Zealand for the last year. And it's part and parcel of the shift to greater level of data linkage and data sharing, and where there's no explicit mechanism for individual consent for the reuse of data. So the fallback has been this idea of social licence, and there's been a national conversation around that. And it's been defined as when people trust that their data will be used as they have agreed and accept that enough value will be created, then they're much more likely to be comfortable with how that data is being used, and that level of comfort is called social licence. So some guidelines on the path to social licence and the trusted use of shared data have just been released about a month ago. It's on the website. If you Google it, you'll be able to find it. One of the concerns that we had as an advocacy network is this was all framed again around individual comfort with how their data are being used. And we argued that actually we need to also have an Indigenous concept of cultural licence, because social licence is necessary but insufficient in the context of shared linked data. And cultural licence has now been, the concept of cultural licence has now been taken up by the Ministry of Primary Industries. It appears in their primary social sector science roadmap. And this is the concept that the ability of an organisation to undertake business in a culturally acceptable way with confidence for Māori treaty partners and tribes. So it's a very different rendering of 1 minute to go. All right, I'm going to wrap this up. So it's a very different rendering of this notion of social license, and it's putting Indigenous lens and it's been quite important for moving the conversation along in Aotearoa. Okay, final example, and this is a community one. It's a project that we're leading out of the University of Waikato called Counting Our Tupuna. Tupuna is ancestors in Aotearoa, New Zealand. It's funded by the Marsden Fund, which is administered by the Royal Society of New Zealand. This is my traditional marae. At the top, I wish I had a laser pointer. At the top there, you can only see a little carving there. That's our eponymous ancestor, Tipa, from where we take our tribal name, Ngāti Tipa. And this project is really about reconstituting our tribal population using some missionary census data from 1844, some government census data from 1858, a whole lot of land records, oral histories, genealogical knowledge that's held by our elders and by our community, and pulling that together to try and reconstitute 3 generations of our tribe from 1844 through to the 1920s. Now, for us as Māori, for us as Ngāti Tipa, our genealogical information, our information about our ancestors and our information about our land, these are the 2 bits, most important kinds of data that kind of define who we are and where we belong and how we connect to each other. And so it was really important from the outset that the tribe owns the data. I don't own the data as a researcher. The funding agency does not own the data. It belongs to the tribe. There's no way they were going to even begin to engage with this project if it wasn't crystal clear from the start who owned the data. It's been kept off the university servers. The data sharing is governed by tikanga, which is customary values and principles. And it's a tikanga-based approach, so the values come from the tribe, it comes from the families, and it comes from the communities. The descendants of these ancestors are the active participants, researchers, and managers in the project. It's not done from the desktop, it's not done from a distance. And the research team is entirely Māori, Māori archaeologists, Māori demographer, Māori oral historian, and we have one non-Māori team member who's our Bayesian statistician. Stereotype confirming, I know. And he's wonderful because he's really trying to engage with the customary knowledge and the qualitative insights that are coming from the families and communities and trying to think, well, then how can he incorporate that into his Bayesian models in terms of modelling the uncertainty? So it's a really great example of how Indigenous grassroots knowledge and kind of Western methodological statistical approaches can come together in a way to advance data sovereignty at the grassroots. So I'm going to leave it here. I'm going to end with 2 pictures here of Te Manara Raunga. This was our first meeting. We're all looking very optimistic and and that was about 2 years ago, held at my tribal college. And this picture here, Jason and Alex came to a workshop that we held about a month ago now, back at the same tribal college. We had 100 participants. I would say 90% of them were from Indigenous communities. And it was a really great way to kind of share our own ideas amongst ourselves of how to advance our Indigenous data sovereignty agenda. And I just want to end here with what we call a whakatauki, or kind of a metaphorical saying, which can kind of guide us into the future. And this one is the one that we use here in our network, Te Manara Raunga, and it's he whenua hou te aurau raunga, te aura raunga he whenua hou. Whenua is the word for land, and the way that we've interpreted that is data is a new world and a world of opportunity, and the challenge is to activate those opportunities and make it happen. Sorry for going over time. Have I left any question time?
Yes, you have. Yes, indeed you have. So that we have 5 minutes.
The licensing side of things, as far as data, I think is a really interesting, way of thinking about how we can get some of that control of and some redress back to the different nation groups for what's happening on their country. So to me, at the moment they use a lot of the data that comes off country, but yet we have no control or no licensing mechanisms within that. But they do that with all other infrastructure, like roads, and it's just something I was thinking about when I've seen that up there. But when you go on a road, they say, oh, we own this road, you need a licence to drive on that. But it's the same thing now. If they're going to use our data, they should be able to. We should have some type of licensing system. And I don't know whether if that's what you meant, but I think it triggered, a thought process for me to say, okay, there may be an opportunity for a licensing system where data can be, controlled through that type of way of doing things.
I did a poor job of explaining social licence, I think. but you raise a really germane point, so I'll address that as well. But first of all, if I just backtrack a little bit to social licence, the whole thing about social licence is there's no actual licence that's granted. It's actually a more kind of intangible sense of the level of comfort that a community has with the activities that are being, in this case, data collection. And so the thinking is, if communities lose confidence or they become uncomfortable with it, they'll just stop giving up data. And so the whole thing around providing guidelines for businesses or organisations to get a intangible social licence from the community is what are the steps they need to go through to make individuals feel comfortable that the way their data are being used are at the very least not harmful and optimally delivering some sort of public good or benefit for the if not for the individuals, then for their communities or for the national good. So there's nothing that's issued, and it's very intangible, but it's increasingly important when data are being used and reused. It's really around secondary use of data, and where individuals haven't given their explicit consent. But the businesses who are using the data kind of need the buy-in from the public that they trust what they're doing with it. So that's where the conversation is kind of going at the moment in New Zealand, is around social licence, not really personal consent. Now, the question that you raise, is there a mechanism to enable Indigenous communities to, whether it's through a licensing mechanism or some other mechanism, to control how that data are then used? I think if we go back to the continuum, there's a continuum of control, right? And trying to assert control over that whole continuum, I think, is probably very futile. And so part of the puzzle is working out which is the data that is important. It's kind of a balancing act. Which is the data that's really important to us and that we want to prioritise and go after control for that. And it's up to the communities to really decide what those data are. But then also balanced against that is, what is the chance that we'll ever actually be able to achieve it? And what are the mechanisms to achieve it? Is it through soft standards and guidelines? Is it through the law? So at the moment we're going through a process of statutory change. So do you have a legal mechanism, or do you have goodwill, corporate social governance? There's all these different levers, I suppose, and it's about about communities and networks figuring out what's the lever to pull to exercise control, and how can non-Indigenous, and I think this is a really important point too, how can a non-Indigenous allies help with that as well? As I didn't talk about that, but it's kind of an elephant in the room. We've got a lot of non-Indigenous people here in the room. What's the role of non-Indigenous allies to assist with an Indigenous-led data sovereignty movement? It's really important.
Well, thank you so much, Tahu, and this is a small token of our appreciation for your enlightening, I'll call it a keynote, because you made some very key points.
Thank you.
And good advice on the continuum and the range of strategies available to us. And if I could just add, as soon as you bring the lawyers in, you'll end up with something that looks like native title. Don't. But, look, at some point, contracts are going to be important, right? But, let's start with something less onerous. We don't have the capacity yet for even thinking about that. I think, some people do, of course, and they might, move on to getting a lawyer to do contracts for other people buying their data. If you're in the market to sell data, absolutely you need contracts. But I think in general we're not talking about that level of marketisation of data yet. We're talking about community use of data and, social use of data, or use of data for good public health outcomes, etc. Of course, you know, artists license their work. You know, an advertising agency might want to buy an artist's work. So they'll pay an annual fee for a licence. I mean, I've done it myself to use an art symbol on a letterhead from an artist, from a living artist. Pay them $100 a year for a licence. You know, they can sell the artwork, but lawyers do those contracts. But I don't think we're in the business yet of selling data. We're in the business of accumulating data, getting access to data. I think that's where we're at. And, you know, talking government departments and other stakeholders into giving us access to data that they don't presently for all sorts of reasons. And we heard a bit yesterday from Fadwa from the Australian Institute of Health and Welfare. These are very real legal problems for her, which is why we have to look at the other end of the spectrum of possibilities. But we have a lot to learn from you, and you're way ahead of, you are in fact way ahead of us. So yeah, we'd like to continue to learn from you. Thank you.
Kick us off.